The glass-walled conference room on the 47th floor had never been this quiet. A billion-dollar deal was minutes from closing. Then the door opened. A man in a janitorial uniform stepped inside, mop still in hand, looking at no one in particular. Victoria Hayes looked up from the signature page. Her voice came low and flat. "Get out of my office." Every head in the room turned. No one moved. Daniel Brooks did not leave. He looked at the projected slide on the far wall just for a moment, and then he said something that stopped the room entirely. "There is a critical error in those financials. If you sign this agreement, you will lose everything." The Callaway Group occupied 9 floors of the Merritt Tower in downtown Chicago, and it ran the way Victoria Hayes had built it: fast, lean, and with very little tolerance for anything that did not move in a straight line toward a result. The lobby was polished granite. The elevators were silent. The people who rode them had learned, through exposure rather than instruction, not to waste her time. Victoria Hayes was 32 years old and had been running the company for 3 years, inheriting a firm that was bleeding clients and credibility in equal measure after her predecessor's quiet departure. She had stopped the bleeding. She had done it through a combination of calculated risk and absolute refusal to show doubt in any room where doubt could be used against her. There was no version of her professional life in which uncertainty was something she could afford to display, and she had internalized this the way athletes internalize the mechanics of a movement so deeply that it was no longer a decision but simply a posture. It had worked. Mostly. But the economy had shifted in the past 18 months, and the Callaway Group now needed something it could not easily manufacture on its own: scale. The proposed merger with Whitfield Capital was not her first choice. She had spent months exploring alternatives, and each one had closed before it opened. This was what remained, and it was viable if the numbers held, and she had made certain that the numbers held. She had reviewed the Whitfield financials herself. She had put her best analysts on the due diligence report. She had personally approved the final term sheet. The signing was scheduled for 11 in the morning, and it would not be the kind of event where things went sideways. Daniel Brooks arrived at the Merritt Tower at 6:15, the same time he arrived every weekday. He badged in through the service entrance on the building's east side, collected his cart from the basement supply room, and worked his way through the floors assigned to his rotation. He was 33 years old, quiet in a way that people often read as simple, and he wore no expression that invited conversation. The maintenance staff on the early shift had stopped trying to draw him out after the first few weeks. He was not unfriendly. He was just contained, in the way that a room can be sealed without being empty. He had a daughter at home. Her name was Lily, and she was 6 years old, and every morning before he left she demanded that he check under her bed for what she called the grumpy shadow that lived there. He always checked. He always reported back that the shadow had packed its things and moved to New Jersey, and she always laughed at that, and the sound of it carried him through the parts of the day that were harder to carry through on his own. She was the most precise human being he had ever encountered. She had opinions about the correct order of breakfast and the proper way to fold a paper airplane and the fundamental unfairness of bedtime, and she expressed all of them with a clarity that he found, most mornings, worth whatever the rest of the day was going to cost him. That was what most people in the Merritt Tower did not know about Daniel Brooks, that he had a daughter who laughed like that. That was not the only thing they did not know. The morning of the signing, the 47th floor was running at a pressure that the maintenance staff had learned to navigate with particular care. It was the kind of pressure that expressed itself not in raised voices but in the opposite, in people who moved too quickly and smiled too deliberately and kept their conversations just inside the range of audible, as though volume itself were a liability. Assistants moved between offices with purpose and no eye contact. A catering crew set up in the small conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. 2 lawyers from outside counsel had arrived early and were working through documents at the glass table, their jackets still on despite the warmth of the room, because taking them off would have felt like relaxing, and relaxing was not on the schedule. Daniel had been assigned to clean the executive corridor that morning. He had been told, as he was occasionally told during high-profile events, to stay clear of the boardroom and the immediate area around the corner offices. The instruction came from the floor manager, a man named Marcus, who delivered it with the tone of someone explaining something to a person who might need it explained twice. Daniel had nodded without comment and continued working. He liked the early hours in the building before it fully woke. The work was physical and required just enough attention to occupy the part of his mind that needed something to do, while leaving the rest of him available for thinking through whatever required thinking through. On most mornings that was Lily her schedule. her school events, the small logistics of raising a child alone, with no margin for error. On this morning, it was the building itself that would interrupt the routine. He was moving the cart past the boardroom's outer wall when the door was left ajar by someone who passed through quickly and did not bother to close it. He was not listening, but the room was not designed for discretion, and voices carried into the corridor with a clarity that proximity made impossible to screen out. He heard the name Whitfield. He heard the phrase, subordinated debt structure. He heard a figure 430 million spoken in a context that did not match the context in which he had seen that figure used before. The number was attached to the wrong line. He understood it the way a carpenter understands when a joint has been cut at the wrong angle, not from theory, but from having built the structure many times. He stopped the cart. He stood in the corridor for a moment, the way a person stands when a sound has pulled them somewhere they were not expecting to go. Then he moved slightly closer to the door, not inside, not to the threshold, just close enough to see the edge of the projection screen through the gap. He saw the consolidated balance sheet. He saw the subsidiary classifications. And something in him that he had spent 3 years keeping very quiet came immediately, quietly awake. He thought about Lily. He thought about her school, and the apartment that was close to it, and the small, careful life they had built together. He thought about the last time he had spoken up in a room that did not want what he had to say, and about what had followed. He ran through the calculation quickly, the way he had run it once before, and arrived at the same answer he had arrived at back then, that he would not be able to live with himself if he said nothing and was right. He picked up the mop handle and walked toward the boardroom door. The room held 14 people. Victoria Hayes sat at the head of the table, her CFO and general counsel flanking her. 3 members of senior leadership ranged along the side. 2 partners from outside counsel near the middle. 4 representatives from Whitfield Capital sat opposite, including their CEO, Gerald Whitfield, a broad man with practiced warmth and the particular ease of someone accustomed to being the most comfortable person in any room. No one registered Daniel immediately, not until he had walked close enough to the table that one of the outside lawyers looked up, confused, then another. Then the quiet spread through the room like a draft. Gerald Whitfield was the first to speak. "I'm sorry, is this some kind of interruption?" "He's maintenance," someone said from the Callaway side of the table. "He must have come in by accident." Victoria had not spoken yet. She was watching Daniel with the expression of someone calculating the cost of a situation before it resolved itself. She made her calculation. "Get out of my office. I need 2 minutes. You need to leave. Now." One of the Whitfield associates laughed, a short, reflexive sound that was more about releasing tension than finding anything genuinely funny. Marcus, the floor manager, had been standing near the credenza with a tablet under his arm and now crossed the room quickly, taking Daniel by the upper arm with the practiced grip of someone managing a situation before it became a scene. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go." "He doesn't even know what EBITDA is," said one of the senior managers from the Callaway side, not maliciously. "Exactly, more as a closing argument, a way of formally ending the matter." A few people at the table permitted themselves brief, private smiles. The small, comfortable smiles of people who have been given permission to stop taking something seriously. Marcus steered Daniel toward the door. They reached the threshold. Daniel stopped, one hand resting gently on the frame, and he spoke without raising his voice or turning fully around, not to perform anything, not for effect, but because he had something specific to say, and the door was almost closed. "The subordinated debt inside Whitfield's offshore subsidiary has been reclassified as equity on the consolidated balance sheet. The actual liability is in the holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The figure on that slide is understated by somewhere between $200 and $300 million. If you execute that agreement, the senior debt covenant in Section 4B trips before the end of the second quarter." Then he stepped out. The door moved almost all the way closed behind him. He set the mop handle back against the cart. He stood in the corridor with his hands in the pockets of his uniform and his expression unchanged, looking at the wall across from him. There was nothing theatrical about it. He was not waiting for applause or vindication, or even to be right. He was simply standing in a corridor, in a building, at a particular moment in his life, having done the only thing he knew how to do when the truth had been directly in front of him. He had said it. The saying of it was now complete. Whatever happened next was no longer in his hands, and he had made a certain peace with that before he ever walked through the door. He waited, inside the boardroom, No one spoke for 3 full seconds. Gerald Whitfield was the first to recover. He leaned back and spread his hands on the table in a gesture designed to project ease. And almost succeeded. That was a maintenance worker who stood near an open door long enough to catch a few words. "This is not worth 60 seconds of our time." Victoria Hayes did not respond to him. She was looking at her CFO. "Martin," she said. Martin Cho had been doing this work for 18 years. He had been in rooms where things went wrong in ways that were expensive and in ways that were only mildly inconvenient, and he had developed the particular professional stillness of a person who has learned not to react until he has something definitive to react to. He was already frowning before his name was spoken. He pulled up the due diligence file on his laptop and navigated to the Whitfield subsidiary section. He found the Whitfield Meridian Partners entity listing in the disclosure appendix. He cross-referenced the offshore holding company and located the equity reclassification footnote buried in the schedule on page 47. He read it. He read it again. "Martin," Victoria said, "I need 2 more minutes." The Whitfield team's expressions were neutral. Too neutral. With the consistency of people maintaining something deliberately. Gerald Whitfield's thumb had stopped its light tapping against the table edge. One of his associates had put his phone face down on the table in front of him, which was not what people did when they were comfortable. Victoria Hayes had built her entire professional career on the ability to read rooms, and she was reading this one. The careful blankness of the Whitfield side told her more than any expression would have. "We're pausing," she said. Her general counsel began to speak. Victoria held up one hand. 10 minutes. "Patricia, please take our guests to the secondary conference room." "Martin, stay." When the room had emptied to the Callaway leadership, she walked to the door and opened it and looked into the corridor. Daniel was still there. He came back in without ceremony. The room was down to Victoria, Martin, Patricia, and 2 members of the senior team. Daniel stood at the projection screen, the way someone stands when they have something specific to point at and no interest in appearing anything other than what they are. "Walk me through it," Victoria said. He did. This entity here, Whitfield Meridian Partners, incorporated in the Cayman Islands. The parent company moved approximately $240 million in subordinated debt into this vehicle 18 months ago. The transfer was structured to meet the criteria for equity classification under the reporting framework Whitfield uses. That classification held through their internal audits and their external review. He paused. But the moment this merger closes, the combined entity reports under a different standard. Under that standard, the equity treatment does not survive. The contribution recharacterizes as debt. The liability the model shows is not the liability the merged company would carry. Martin was pulling up the relevant entries before Daniel finished each sentence. He found them. He cross-referenced the coverage ratios in the term sheet against the corrected liability figure. The cash flow projections on page 31 of your summary model assume a debt load that is 2/3 smaller than the actual obligation. Daniel continued. The covenant in Section 4B, the 4 times interest coverage requirement, would breach based on a conservative rate assumption inside the first 2 quarters of combined operations, possibly sooner. He looked at Martin. "I can identify the specific journal entries that establish the reclassification, if that would help the legal team." One of the outside lawyers had come back into the room partway through. He was now standing near the wall, very still, in the way that lawyers stand when they are recalibrating what they should have found on their own. "How do you know this structure?" Patricia asked. "I've built it," Daniel said. "From the other side." He said it without elaboration, and no one pressed him on it, because the answer to every follow-up question was already apparent in the room. He knew because he had been the kind of person who understood these structures at their core, and for reasons that were not yet clear, he was no longer operating in any capacity that suggested it. Patricia made notes with a consistency that suggested she was already constructing the outline of the document she would need to produce. One of the senior leadership team members had stopped watching the screen and started watching Daniel instead, with the particular attention of someone who is trying to understand how a person who knows what this man knows arrives at work at 6:15 in the morning with a maintenance cart. Daniel did not seem to notice, or if he did not seem to find it worth acknowledging. He had the focused quality of someone who is solving a specific problem in a specific room. And when the problem is solved, they will stop. Martin looked at Victoria. His expression was precise and definitive. "He's right," Martin said. "On the liability reclassification, the coverage ratio, all of it." He closed the laptop partially and set his hands flat on the table. If we had signed this morning, we would have known by the end of the first quarter. We would not have been happy about what we found. The outside lawyer near the wall had taken out a notepad and was writing something, and the deliberateness with which he was writing it suggested that he was composing something more than notes. Victoria sat back in her chair. She looked at Daniel Brooks standing at the projection screen in a maintenance uniform, his hands at his sides, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has delivered what he came to deliver, and is now simply present for whatever comes next. "Keep going," she said. "All of it." The picture that emerged over the following 40 minutes was not limited to the offshore liability. As Daniel worked through the disclosure documents with Martin Cho, a second layer of the problem became visible. The due diligence file that the Callaway team had relied on was not simply incomplete. It had been shaped. The offshore entity disclosures were in the appendix. They were not buried. They were not written in a way that required specialist interpretation. They required only that someone who reviewed the document actually read it. The decision to omit the implications from the summary analysis had been made by someone who had read the document and understood it, and chose not to include what they found. Patricia Holt was the one who said it in explicit terms. Someone on our side reviewed this and decided to keep it out of the report. The room was quiet for a moment. "Who assembled the final due diligence summary?" Victoria asked. "That ran through Neil's team," Martin said. He did not look up from his laptop when he said it. Neil Chambers had been with the Callaway Group for 6 years. He had been the loudest internal advocate for the Whitfield transaction in strategy meetings, in board updates, in the direct conversations with Victoria over the past several months, where he had characterized the deal as essential and the terms as clean. He was not in the boardroom that morning. There had been no particular reason for his absence at the time it was scheduled. There was a very particular reason for it now. Patricia was already on her phone. Her instructions to the operations team were brief and not open to interpretation. Victoria had the Whitfield delegation brought back in. Gerald Whitfield came through the door with the expression of a man who has not decided yet whether to appear confident or concerned, and had settled temporarily on neutral. Victoria looked at him across the table. There was no diplomatic warmth in it. "We are suspending the signing. Our team has identified material undisclosed liabilities in the Whitfield Meridian entity structure. We'll be in contact with your counsel." She stood. "I'd ask that you not leave the building immediately. Patricia will want to speak with your team." Gerald Whitfield's neutral expression lasted another 2 seconds, and then it became something else, not anger, not exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been looking at a closed door and has just heard the lock turn from the inside. When they had gone, Victoria turned to where Daniel was standing near the wall. He had not sat down through any part of it. He had answered every question he was asked, and contributed nothing beyond what was asked, and he had not once looked at anyone in the room with anything that resembled vindication. "You waited in the corridor," she said. "I thought you'd check. What if I hadn't?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then I would have left," he said, "and tried to figure out another way." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not offer anything further, and she did not ask. "Thank you," she said. She assembled the file herself over 2 days. She used sources she trusted and did not assign the research to anyone else, because the kind of question she was answering, who is this person, and what actually happened to him, was the kind that required handling with a care she was not sure anyone else would apply. Daniel Brooks had a graduate degree in financial economics from Northwestern, completed at 24. He had joined Hargrove Capital after graduation and had worked his way through the analyst structure with the consistency of someone who was good at the work and not particularly interested in credit for being good at it. He had been considered, by those who worked alongside him, unusually reliable in the specific area of identifying what was wrong in structures that other people had already approved. In his 7th year, he had identified a problem in a transaction Hargrove was structuring. The problem was material. His firm's senior management was aware of it and had made a calculation about how to proceed that did not include unwinding the work or disclosing it to the client. When Daniel escalated the concern in writing, the firm made a different calculation, that it was more practical to make Daniel the source of the problem than to acknowledge having created it. He was terminated. He was removed from the professional registry through the kind of quiet, networked action that leaves no visible marks but closes every door connected to it. He was told, in language that was pleasant on its surface and unambiguous underneath, that pursuing the matter would not be to his advantage. He had a 2-year-old daughter and no family close enough to be useful. The woman who had been his partner had left before Lily turned 1. He fought the situation for several months, through channels that turned out to be controlled by the same network that had decided he should not exist professionally. He spent money he did not have. He spent time that Lily needed. He did the arithmetic and stopped. He found work that was stable and anonymous. He found an apartment near a school. He built a life that was deliberately small and entirely present, organized not around the recovery of what had been taken, but around the protection of what remained. Victoria read all of it alone, late at night, her office lit, and the city dark beyond the glass. She sat with it for a while before she closed the file. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when she had told a man holding a mop to get out of her office, and she thought about what it had cost him the last time he had decided to say something true in a room that did not want to hear it, and she thought about the fact that he had said it again anyway. She found him on a Thursday evening in the parking structure, returning his cart at the end of a shift. He had taken off his work gloves and tucked them into his back pocket. And in that small thing end of day, ungloved, he looked momentarily like someone who had been doing something else entirely. He saw her coming and did not look surprised. "I wanted to tell you in person," Victoria said. "Neil Chambers has been terminated. The merger is formally cancelled. Legal has referred the matter to the appropriate authorities. Our outside counsel is in contact with Whitfield's team." She paused. "And I wanted to apologize for the way I handled the room." "You were protecting your company," Daniel said. The skepticism made sense. "Maybe. Not the way I expressed it." He received this without performed gratitude and without the lingering resentment that would have made things harder. He simply acknowledged it, with a quiet inclination of his head, the kind that closes a parenthesis without requiring what comes next to be another sentence in the same paragraph. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "In this building." He thought for a moment. "Lily's school is 4 blocks from the east entrance. The shift ends before afternoon pickup. The schedule is consistent." He paused. "She needs consistent." Victoria had been prepared for any number of answers. She had been expecting something about staying out of reach of the people who had dismantled his career, about keeping a profile low enough that the network which had worked against him could not find him again. What she heard instead was a father who had organized his entire professional life around a 6-year-old's school pickup time, and the plain practicality of it rearranged something she hadn't known was out of place. She could come and see the office sometime, Victoria said, if she'd like to. Something moved across his expression that was near a smile. She would ask about the cafeteria first. There is one. Then she would definitely say yes. In the weeks that followed, Lily visited on a Saturday morning when the building was mostly quiet. She was small and unhesitant, and very specific in her assessments. She told Victoria that the office was extremely shiny. She located the executive pantry and ate a quantity of cereal that impressed even the building's facilities manager when told about it later. Then she fell asleep on the corner sofa with her shoes still on while her father sat nearby, and Victoria worked at her desk. And it was the most ordinary afternoon that office had held in a long time. The conversation about his future unfolded across several weeks, and Victoria was deliberate about not rushing it. She understood enough about Daniel to know that offering him the equivalent of his old role, restoring him, as it were, to the position that had been taken from him, would satisfy something in her more than it would serve him. It would be a story she could tell cleanly, a wrong made right, a closed circle. But Daniel's life was not organized around clean circles. It was organized around a daughter and a school schedule and a carefully maintained simplicity that had cost him something real to build. She had no right to disturb it in the name of her own sense of appropriate resolution. She offered him an independent advisory arrangement instead. Specific projects, flexible scheduling, no desk and no title that would require him to reconstruct the institutional life he had spent 3 years carefully stepping away from. The terms were clean. The rate reflected what the work was worth. The scope was limited to what he was genuinely good at, and nothing else. He did not accept immediately. He said he would think about it, and she believed him, and she did not follow up. 2 weeks later, 3 sentences arrived by email. He had thought about it. He had a few questions about the scope, and he would take it. He did not change his apartment. He did not announce anything. He did not move through the building with a new badge and a new purpose, collecting the respect that had been denied him. He simply began doing different work, and the work was very good. And the people who encountered its results understood that without always being certain whose hands had done it. On the morning he signed the agreement, he picked Lily up from school at 3:15. She was carrying a drawing of what she called a very tall house with a lot of windows, and she asked if he had had a good day, and he said yes, actually an exceptionally good one, and she said good because she had also had a good day, and this required pasta. They went to the restaurant 2 blocks from their apartment. She ordered pasta with butter and an ambitious volume of Parmesan. He ordered coffee and watched her eat and thought about nothing in particular, which was something he had taught himself to do well and fully intended to keep doing. On the 47th floor, Victoria stood at the window that faced the lake. The water was gray and still in the late afternoon light. She had a call in 20 minutes. There was always a call. She looked at the city below her and thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when a man with a mop had stood in her boardroom and told her the truth, and she had told him to get out. She had built her professional instincts around a simple principle: trust the credentials, trust the titles, trust the people who fit the shape of the room they are standing in. It had served her well. It had also come within 8 minutes of costing her everything she had built. She turned away from the window and picked up her phone. Outside, Daniel and Lily walked home through the early evening, their shadows stretching long and thin across the sidewalk in front of them. She was telling him, with complete seriousness, about a dispute she had mediated that afternoon between 2 classmates over a purple marker. "I told them to share," she said, "because the marker belongs to whoever actually needs it right now." Daniel thought about this. "That is a very reasonable position." "I know," she said, in the tone of someone who has not yet learned to be surprised that reasonable positions are not always obvious to everyone. He smiled. The evening was ordinary and unhurried and entirely sufficient, and he held her hand and walked, and did not need it to be anything else. Sometimes the person you dismiss without a second thought is the only one in the room who can see what you are walking toward, not because they need to prove something, not because they have been waiting for a chance to be seen, but because the truth does not care what uniform you are wearing when you find it, and the people who have already paid the full price of speaking it once tend to recognize it faster than anyone else in the room.